Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We are building a community of people interested in positively applying behavioral science to their work and life. We do this by having fun and engaging conversations with a wide variety of people. In this episode, we are continuing our series with Carnegie Mellon researchers and sharing a conversation we had with Professor Jeff Galak.
Jeff is an associate professor of marketing in the Tepper School of Business at CMU, and he is on loan to the Social and Decision Sciences Department that resides in the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And he is a great fit for that interdisciplinary group. Jeff's research spans consumer behavior, consumer psychology, as well as judgment and decision-making. His findings have been published in top academic journals, and he has made presentations at top marketing and psychology conferences around the world. On top of that, Tim and I found him to be just an interesting and curious guy, and he was lots of fun to talk to.
We discussed several topics within his research purview, but focused on three areas. We discussed Jeff's findings in his new research that he's doing on hedonic decline, which is sort of like the economic theory of diminishing marginal utility. We also discussed some fun new research about women changing the height of the heels that they wear when making a move from a high socioeconomic zip code to a lower one, and vice versa.
High heels and social implications. Do we get to talk about the strangest things ever?
We pretty much cover it all.
Finally, Jeff covered some of his work researching political lies. Two key components of that are lies about policies and personal lies. And do we care about one type of lie more than we care about another?
You're going to have to listen to hear Jeff talk about it.
In our grooving session, Tim and I tackle the implication of some of Jeff's findings for our work and life. We also groove on how product developers can create more successful products by leveraging some of these findings. And we discussed the implications of high-heeled social changes.
Pun intended.
Yeah, maybe.
So sit back and enjoy another episode in our Carnegie Mellon series with Professor Jeff Galak. Welcome, Jeff Galak, to the Behavioral Grooves podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We're glad that you're here. I'd like to start with a speed round. So, Monet or Michelangelo?
Monet.
Bike or unicycle?
Bike.
Live your life without a laptop or without a mobile device?
Laptop.
Which is easier to make, a table or a chair?
Oh, a table, easily.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, okay. Why is that? Why is a table easier?
A chair you have to shape to somebody's contour to make it comfortable. Tables, 4 legs, an apron, a top. It's pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Okay.
Woodworker extraordinaire here. So this
false.
Let's start with talking about research you're working on right now.
Sure. So one project I'm working on that I'm pretty excited about, this is with my collaborator, Clayton Critcher. He's at UC Berkeley. And we were interested in understanding political lies. So in today's climate, it's not too surprising that that's an interesting topic to think about.
That's not topical at all.
No,
wow, how in the world could you come up with that? Wow.
I can't think of any politician who lies. Not one.
Fortunately, wow.
Yeah, funny enough, we start the paper by basically citing something from, thousands of years ago saying, political lies have been around basically forever. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's good.
It's not a new thing.
It's definitely not a new thing.
Good.
Though,
good to know.
What is new is it seems like it's becoming more commonplace. So nobody's surprised that politicians lie, right? Why are politicians' lips moving, right? That's the old joke. But why today is it something that we're seeing all the time? And so what we want to do is kind of follow a systematic investigation from the individual's perspective. How do we interpret a lie, and why do we excuse it sometimes and not other times?
Oh, that's fascinating.
And so some of it is straightforward enough. If I'm a Democrat and a Democrat politician lies, I might be more likely to excuse that lie than if a Republican politician lies, and vice versa, right?
Right.
Although I guess the vice versa isn't obvious. There's been a lot of research in psychology looking at kind of how are Republicans or conservatives different than liberals or Democrats. And a lot of the research is very down on Republicans. And you could make a lot of arguments for why that is true. It could just be the case that Republicans have more issues than Democrats, or you could make the argument that academics were very liberal by nature, and so maybe we're biased. And I think that both sides have their points. We didn't want to take that position. We really wanted to look at this agnostically and say, let's just see what happens in people's responses to lies. So the way that we studied this is we said, we actually, ironically, we lied to our participants with ethical approval. We've, everything's clean. We debriefed them at the end.
Yeah.
Everything's
went
right.
through IRB.
We went through IRB. We did the whole thing.
Good.
And what we did is we told them that to read what they believed was a real newspaper article that described a situation where a politician lied. Sometimes the lie was a tweet, because we thought that was pretty topical too. Sometimes it was part of a speech, just didn't really matter. But the politician we changed to be either a Democrat or a Republican lying about something topical, like it could be gun control or increasing minimum wage or something that was politically relevant. And then we asked individuals a series of questions to understand how they responded to that lie. We also identified whether they themselves were Democrats or Republicans.
Was the lie revealed? So this is based on some fact, right?
Just to be clear, there was a statement made by the politician, something like, when minimum wage goes up, unemployment skyrockets. That would be a lie. That's actually not true. There's no objectively, there's no evidence for that to be true. Nor is it true to say when minimum wage goes up, unemployment decreases.
Right.
That's also not true. It turns out there's just not very good evidence for either side of the argument. So a Democrat politician might say unemployment would go down. A Republican politician might say employment would go up. Right. It's consistent with their beliefs.
Okay.
And then we ask individuals a series of questions of the following form. So the first we ask people, do you think the statement is true?
Okay.
Right? So they might believe it's true or not, right? And so there's this idea of fake news that's out there. So this is kind of targeting that type of question. Regardless of what they say to that, we go to the next question and we say, do you think the politician in this case believed the statement to be true?
Oh.
What's important is in the newspaper article, not only do they describe the lie, but they describe independent research that was done to debunk the lie, to say that's just not the case. So we want to say, well, do you think the politician was doing this roughly intentionally, or were they just kind of ignorant themselves and they just said what they said? But then most critically, we say, do you think it's justifiable for the politician to lie, to make the statement that he did? And we want to see what they say. And the idea is that we're really interested in that third point.
Yeah.
But the first two are important to understand as well. And so I won't go into all the details, but we basically take statistical controls for those first two and say above and beyond your belief of whether the statement is true, above and beyond your belief of whether you believe the politician thinks the statement is true, is it okay for the person to lie? Right? And so you do find both sides have partisan favoritism. So if a Democrat lies, if I'm a Democrat myself, I excuse it more so than if a Republican lied, and vice versa. And that wasn't super surprising, to be perfectly honest.
No.
But the surprising piece was when we tried to vary the nature of the lie itself. So we classified two types of lies. The first type of lie is what we call a policy lie, which is very much what I described a moment ago. It's a lie designed to advance a policy initiative. So
using unemployment as and the minimum wage
as one example. We did it for that. We did it for gun control. So a lie would be stricter gun control laws increase or decrease violent crime. Turns out there's not that much of a relationship between the two. We actually strategically picked those types of topics. We looked at immigration reform, so thinking about as immigrants move into a city, does crime increase or decrease? Again, there's some evidence maybe that it decreases, but it's weak evidence at best. So to make that hard claim, it's not genuine on either side of the discussion.
Okay.
So those types of topics, those would all be what we call policy lies. And on the other end is what we call personal lies. These are lies that are not meant to advance an agenda necessarily, but they're designed to advance the self. So I want to make myself look better. And this was inspired actually by Ben Carson. So if you remember Ben Carson back in the last presidential election when he was running for the Republican primary,
Yep.
he made a statement that at some point he was stabbed in the belt buckle when he was a young person. And the reason that was argued for why he made that statement was to give himself more credibility.
Okay.
To say, like, look at me, like, I've been through this. I know what crime is about. I know what life on the street is like.
I've been a victim, so I can relate
Yeah.
to you and you can relate to me.
Right. And then when a bunch of journalists started investigating this, they said there is absolutely no evidence that this has ever happened, right? So unequivocally, all the objective evidence says that was a lie, right? And so that statement doesn't advance a policy position in any way, right? There's no obvious direction that would go, but it could advance him if it's believed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so then we ask the question, do people excuse those lies? And the answer is no, on both sides of the aisle.
No, for the personal lives.
For the personal lives.
So policy lies are more forgivable based upon if you're in tribe or out tribe, right? Yep. And then, however, it's those personal lies, they're inexcusable across the
Pretty much across the board. Yeah.
Interesting.
So we found that to be really interesting. So it's not just, hey, you're a Republican, I'm a Republican. I don't care what you do as long as it's helping Republicans or Democrat helping Democrat. That's not what we're finding. We're finding it's really when it's advancing an agenda that people will excuse the lie. When it's advancing just the person, lying is bad. We all kind of know that. Doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. We say it's bad.
How does that play out in the real world in the current administration?
Sure.
For
So
instance?
there's going to be, so just to be clear, this isn't a universal. It's not that every Democrat excuses every other Democrat.
No.
And it's not that every Democrat condemns every single personal lie, and it's true for Republicans. It's that these are relative differences. So I think that when a sitting president lies about his own experiences, we don't excuse those to the same extent. There is more uproar about those as compared to when the lies are directed to advance some particular initiative. You'll see more support for a Republican policy lie coming from the current president than you will for just flagrant random things.
So it's a relative component then.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which makes absolutely, when you're looking at current news and you're seeing current response rates, I think that plays itself out. You can see that. You can at least, my N of one in looking at my news feed would probably go, yeah, that makes sense. That's really an interesting component.
We would actually love to do something like a deep dive study into newspaper articles and how people respond to different forms of lies. So one idea that we've had that we haven't done yet is looking at PolitiFact. And so they do fact checking for people's statements. And you can actually say, fact check this person or this political party, and they can kind of break it down. So it'd be great to see, go through all those. First of all, see what types of lies exist. We do know that there's plenty of examples of both personal and policy lies. You can eyeball that.
Right.
But better would be to see, when somebody does have a policy lie out on Twitter, what are the tweets that respond to them, and do it systematically, not just one particular tweet, but go through, the entire corpus of lies coming out of whomever, both sides,
right?
Ideally both sides, right? You definitely want to do both sides. And see what the response looks like as a much more naturalistic test of this as opposed to a laboratory construction.
So Jeff, so looking at the difference between how people accept or don't accept a policy lie versus a personal lie, did your research get into the why?
Yeah. So what we look for, what we try to understand is what's driving this difference, and the difference is a change in trust.
Okay.
So if a politician lies and it's a policy lie, I still trust them. Because at the end of the day, the reason you tend to think that they're making that lie is because they're trying to do something good, right? It's a lie to advance an agenda that you believe in. So I still trust them in general.
Interesting.
But if they lie and it's just some, BS thing about their history, that's weird, and I don't trust you anymore. And if I don't trust you anymore, I'm not going to support you. So it's that change in trust that really drives this.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Is that, and I don't know if you've done any of this, but is that the same? This is politics, right? And political. Is it the same, say, in a corporate environment where, and I'm not sure if there's any of that research that's out there, but that would be another interesting thing. So my, VP gets caught in a lie about some sort of corporate policy or direction versus a personal lie about him or herself,
I mean, admittedly, we're focused on the political domain because it was topical. I think the problem with studying this in a corporate context is we don't have like PolitiFact like we do for politics. It's hard to
very
know.
hard to identify.
Have an objective perspective on this.
Yeah, and I also imagine that most execs are not making too many personal statements in general, right, in the public sphere. Maybe they are, right, but certainly not in the media sphere. They're mostly going to be talking about their company and what they're doing and their business. So I don't know. I mean, it's plausible that the same would be true, but it's hard for me to make that claim.
Well, and it's less likely to your point of saying you're not going to be making those individual, statements that are going to be about yourself and, trying to, make yourself look better.
Yeah.
Outside of a few people, maybe. I don't know.
So if historians agree that politicians have been lying for literally thousands of years, is it possible that our DNA is just getting. Are we just starting to accept the idea that if this is a politician, they're going to lie to us?
So I don't want to speak to genetics because that is far afield from where I study. Maybe, right? But
I'm perplexed as to why we're willing to put up with it at all.
It's a great question, and I'll say that I think that's a question for a sociologist or an anthropologist looking at culture more broadly than I do. My kind of, let's put it, say, lay opinion of this, because I'm not going to be the scientist at this point. I think the shortening of the news cycle has really played a role here, where it used to be that if somebody lies, it takes a while before we stop talking about it. It's a big topic. It's unusual. Now, with the increased prevalence and shorter news cycle, where we just always move on to the next thing quickly, you can get away with it, right? You lie. It's excused by the partisans that support you most of the time. And then we're just on to the next topic because you have to, right? That's how you fill a 24-hour news cycle.
Right.
I think that's very unique to the present time in history as compared to if we go back even 50 years. That just didn't exist, right? You had a newspaper, you read it, you digested that for a while, you talked about it with your peers and colleagues, and then maybe the next day something else happened. I mean, even that's 24 hours. We don't have that anymore. Right?
We don't even have 24 hours.
It's much shorter than that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Okay.
But I'll say
that is examples. Yeah.
It's worth saying that's probably my more personal observations than anything I can back with research.
Back with any research.
That's just not what I study.
No, but
we got to get a sociologist in here to have that discussion.
Yeah, we need to do that.
It's a fascinating question. Yeah.
All right. So that's some current research that you're working on. So you've done a lot of research. So what is some research that you've done that you go, wow, this just didn't get the attention that I thought it would, or, people need to know about this. This is really important stuff. Help us understand maybe some of the stuff that you might have done. So
this will be different from what most of my research is, but it's probably one of my favorite papers that I've written that has almost no attention given to it. Yeah. So it's a paper that looks at how women purchase shoes as a function of the height of the heel of the shoes.
Okay.
I know.
How women purchase shoes based on the height of the heel.
Yeah. I promise there's science back here somewhere. So
bring it on.
A question that is in the kind of realm of social psychology is this question of conformity versus keeping your individual preferences. So
social
kind of consistency,
norms.
Exactly, versus kind of consistency in identity. And those are two completely opposed forces, right? On the one hand, I have this desire to keep my identity as who I am, right?
Yep.
On the other hand, I've got norms that I need to follow to fit in with other people, right? Those are exactly the opposite most of the time that they're kind of at ends with one another. And there's a lot of research studying those two different ideas in isolation. So there's plenty of evidence to say that there's conformity out there. There's plenty of evidence to say that we kind of maintain our identity and stick to who we are. And what we wanted to do, this was with a few collaborators, is try to say, can we look at a context where those two intersect and we can study them simultaneously? And oddly enough, that context presented itself as heel height in women's shoes.
I think oddly enough is a good good introductory phrase on that. Yeah.
So let me explain.
Okay.
What we have is a data set of actual purchases of shoes from, and I'm not allowed to say it, there's a non-disclosure agreement, but from an online retailer of high-end, high-fashion shoes. So these are multi-$100 shoes. This is not like Payless Shoe Store or something like that, although that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So anybody, it's actually not an exclusively a site exclusive to women, but the context that we're studying is going to be women's shoes, in part because there's a very nice quantifiable thing that we can study, which is the height of heels.
Okay.
So this website tracks in a continuous manner what the heel height is, so 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches, and everything in between, as opposed to, say, something else in fashion that we can study like color, which is a little trickier, like red versus blue. It's just, both statistically, that's harder to study. It's harder to categorize that, to see, like, do people adapt to preference or not. But heel height, boy, is it easy. Like, if I wear a 1 inch heel and you wear a 1 inch heel, that suggests that we're doing something similar. 3 inch heel, 1 inch heel, different, right? And it's very easy to deal with statistically, so it was nice.
Let me just say that that's not something that I've often thought about. Like, am I a 1 inch heel or a 3 inch heel? And if you're a 3 inch heel and I'm a 1 inch heel, then
you're
really
much
different.
more the 3 inch heel. I just want to let you know.
Yeah. So I admit I also have never thought about this before this project. But what we have is really interesting. So we've got a time series of data. So this is a panel data of women who made these purchases, repeated purchases in shoes, because by more than one. And what's even more important is we can identify where they live from a zip code basis, and we can identify when they move. So if somebody, let's say, bought a series of items from this store, online store, not just shoes, in zip code A, and then all of a sudden every future transaction is in zip code B, we classify that person as having moved. We're not certain that they moved. There could be certainly other reasons, but most likely the reason that that shift occurred is because they moved locations. And then what we could do is we can track how their preferences change as a function of where they move to. So what we can say is the following. If you moved from, let's say, a high heel area, because we can say everybody else in that zip code is wearing high heels on average.
So you're seeing on average zip code A, they're averaging 3-inch heels, where zip code B is 1-inch heels.
Right. So the question is, do you stick to what you've been doing all this time and keep with those 3-inch heels, or do you adapt and conform to the social norms and wear 1-inch heels or flats or whatever it might be? And the answer is it depends on the change in socioeconomic status between those two zip codes. So if you move to a wealthier environment, you adapt those preferences.
Okay.
If you move to a similar or poorer environment, you keep your preferences.
So when I'm moving up to Country Club, I'm gonna adapt the social norms. If I'm moving down to Sam's Club, I'm going to keep my
exactly right
to be exclusive. I'll be the Country Club in
That's
the Sam's Club.
That's a wonderful example of it. Yep. And so what's nice is it doesn't matter if heel height where you move goes up or down. So this isn't about like everybody's adapting to high heels or something like that. You might move to an environment where heel height is very low,
right?
And you adapt those preferences.
You're tracking the trends independent of these particular changes.
You're tracking independent of what direction the change went. Just
right.
whatever it is in that new location. If that's a wealthier zip code, you adapt that preference.
Right.
And so what's really interesting is we think this is one of the first times certainly with like real data, I shouldn't say real data, or field data. Let's say field data. There we go. Field data as opposed to lab data. We simultaneously observe conformity and consistency, right? So conformity when you go up in SES and consistency when you stay flat or go down in SES. And we find that to be really interesting. And that paper has gotten like 5 citations over the last 7 years. And so I wish more people would pay attention to it.
It is really interesting. Yeah. And I wonder, is there other work around this idea of adapting when moving up and trying to be consistent with our self schemas and self identities when we move down?
So not much. So there's some work looking at kind of when do people experience social conformity more generally, and so it's not surprising when there's aspirational groups you might conform more to those than when it's not.
Yeah.
But it's not investigated in kind of the same way that when we have nice field data, really good observations. And by the way, heels. One of the reasons that they're phenomenally interesting is they're something that everybody observes. Right, so you see it in other people, which is another unique reason why this is worth studying.
Right.
For heel height, like you wouldn't see somebody's movie preferences. We actually thought about doing that. So we have another data set that with movie purchase data, and we have the same thing. We could identify people who move, and then we didn't do the study because we said, well, you know what? How are you ever going to know what movies on Netflix or whatever you're watching back home? People don't talk about it to the same extent that you see somebody else's fashion choices every single day.
Right. So you don't have that social proof component that comes with that. So making sure I understand, just to go back, but wealth isn't associated with the height of the heel. So 3-inch heels are not. It's dependent upon the location and various different pieces.
Yeah.
And so did you get into some of the why? Why are people acclimating or adopting the wealthier shoe heel size versus not?
In this particular paper, no. And the reason is because all we had were transaction data. This was unlike a lab study where we can go and ask people whatever we want.
So there's no surveys. There's no focus groups.
And that's what's really nice.
It's just observable data.
It's observable to the company.
Yeah, to the company.
Yeah. Right. They have their sales data. They track what products they sold and to whom, and they shared anonymized version of that with us.
I love that, though.
Yeah.
I love that.
Wow.
Oh, fun stuff.
Okay. In the paper, by the way, we do break out, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but we break out, if anybody's curious, kind of where the high heels are, where the flats are, and where you adapt, and what the different SESs are. So we break it down a little bit to give some example of this. So I encourage listeners to go find the paper.
Go find the paper. What's the title of the paper? Do you remember?
I don't. Did you have my CV?
We'll put it in the show notes.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Okay. We'll put it in the show notes, and we'll have a link
and
if it's
published
out there.
at +1, so it's an open access journal.
Okay, perfect.
Anybody can read it.
That's terrific. Well, we'll make sure that we get that in the show notes so that people can have access to that, because I think that will generate a lot of interest.
It's a fun paper.
Well,
that's very cool.
I actually am going to go out and look at it. So there you go.
So
interest of one.
Yeah. So before we talk about music, we'd like to have you boil all of your research experience down to 3 tips.
3 tips for listeners.
For our
For
listeners,
listeners.
yeah.
For our
So
listeners.
our listeners are out there. It's about the application of behavioral science to life and work. So, what are a couple things that you can suggest to our listeners that will make their work or life better?
There's a little bit of backstory to this, but the 2 things that we just talked about, the heel height and the politics, they're actually anomalies in my research program. Most of what I do is a study of what we call hedonic decline. So this is a term that we've coined recently, but basically this is the idea that most enjoyable things with time and repetition become less enjoyable. This is not surprising to most people, right? That's the context that we study. So we've done a lot of work looking at why that is, how do you slow that down, what consequences this has for individuals and for firms and so on. And so that's the bulk of the research that I've done. The joke is always, the reason I don't want to talk about it necessarily is because I'm tired of talking about the thing that I've been doing.
The things that you write
I'm
about all the time.
No longer enjoying it, but But anyways,
you do. This is your life work, right?
Certainly for the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, that's significant.
Okay, so what do we know from it? One of the neat things that we've found, and this is a few collaborators, in particular one I always want to call out is Joe Redden. He's in the University of Minnesota. He's a good friend and collaborator, is that the old way of thinking about hedonic decline, or some people, for those who prefer different terms, think of it as satiation or habituation or adaptation or diminishing marginal utility for economists. It's all basically the same thing with different some differences in there, but more or less the same thing.
But for the time being, we're going to say that hedonic decline is pretty much the coolest thing on the face of the earth.
That's what we're going to go with. We just wrote a nice review paper where we call it hedonic decline, and I'm going to try and own that label. So
Let's do it.
But anyway, so most of the research in that space for the last 100 years or so, this is not a new topic, has conceived of the way that hedonic decline happens as something like a meter that your body or your mind tracks. So as you go through your day, something in your head, probably, sometimes it's more physiological in nature, tracks, I've eaten so many M&Ms, so I shouldn't have more M&Ms. I've eaten 10 of them, so the 11th isn't going to be good. Or it's been 3 hours since I last watched a movie, so let me watch a movie, right? So there's very quantitative tracking of what's been going on. And what my collaborators and I have said, and that's probably right, but we understand human psychology enough to say that there is no meter that says I've had 10 units of something or 3 hours of something or whatever it is. Instead, what happens is we construct those things on the fly. And so in the moment you're about to consume something else, let's say the next M&M or the next movie or the next song perhaps, something in your system, in your brain, says, well, what does it feel like in terms of how many I've had in the past? And what does it feel like in terms of how far back in time that last experience was? Or the other one is, what does it feel like in terms of how much other stuff have I consumed that's relevant to this? And it's that feeling that actually drives subsequent enjoyment, choice to reconsume something, as opposed to the absolute magnitude of how much was consumed. So I'll give you one example. If you just had 10 M&Ms, is that a lot of M&Ms or is that few M&Ms?
I don't know.
I have no idea as well.
I have no idea.
Right? I have no idea.
Kurt normally keeps track of that.
Not enough for me. That's all I'm saying. It's 10 M&Ms, not nearly enough.
Right. But
that's me.
But the uncertainty, right? But that kind of makes the point, right? We don't know. And there's no meter in our body to tell us, oh, you've had 10, therefore the 11th one is going to be this enjoyable, or therefore you should stop, or therefore you should continue. Instead, we use whatever context we have around us to determine whether 10 is a lot or few. And I, as the experimenter or marketer, perhaps, can manipulate the context to make it feel like you've had a lot or had few. So we have one study in particular where we're really interested in food consumption. And we have a study that we ran with Panera Breads. So we went to the Panera Bread, one of the local Panera Breads here. And what we were looking at is subjective time perception. So not when did you eat your lunch, but what does it feel like you last ate your lunch? And what I can do is I could change that feeling. And if I made you feel like lunch happened a long time ago, you buy more and eat more at Panera Breads. And if I make you feel like lunch was pretty recent, you buy less and eat less at Panera Breads.
Oh my gosh.
So depending on who you are, policymaker trying to minimize something like obesity, or firm trying to maximize consumption or purchase, you can really move people around in terms of what they're actually going to do. Real behaviors like eating. We have other studies where we look at things like music consumption to say, do you enjoy listening to the song the nth time? Well, it's not a function of how many times you listen to it. It's a function of how many times it feels like you listen to it. So one instantiation of that is we might say, on a scale from 1 to 15 or more, how many times have you listened to this song? And let's say you listen to it 12 times or something like that. Well, it feels like a lot, right?
Yeah.
But On that scale, that's a lot.
Yeah.
On another scale, for another group of participants, I might say, how many times did you listen to this? 1 to 1,000 times or something like
Now
that.
it's
And you're
12.
like, oh, well, that doesn't feel like a lot at all. I love listening to that song again. And it's all it takes. It's a very small shift in perception of how much you've consumed or when you consumed it or what other things you've consumed that changes real enjoyment and subsequent choice to reconsume.
So how you frame thinking about the amount of consumption that you've had.
Yeah.
Yeah,
For example, how much consumption, when you consumed it, and then the third variable is usually how many other things you've consumed. So we could imagine having a varied experience, like a playlist with one band versus many bands on it. The one with many bands on it is generally going to be more enjoyable for longer.
So when I get in the car and my kids put Hamilton on
Right.
for the upteenth time,
Right. Some variety in between those exposures
it would make it better. So I should say, you should just let me listen to my music for a couple songs and then go in because I will enjoy it better and I will allow you to actually listen
Although,
as opposed to.
as a small aside, what's really interesting about this area of hedonic decline is that in theory, though in practice it doesn't manifest too much, there's before hedonic decline occurs,
Okay.
for novel stimuli, so for
Yeah.
something you've never heard before, there actually tends to be an escalation of enjoyment. So
Yes.
if I were to plot this over time, there's this initial increase in enjoyment, which is short-lived, but then there's this precipitous decline that happens afterwards.
Well, we'll talk music because Tim always talks music later. But when you talk about that, there's that initial response that I get that you hear a new song that first time and it catches you. But then the second time, it's like, oh yeah, this is, and you do. And so that for that first couple times of listening, you're like, oh, I like that song. You listen to more of the lyrics, you get to understand more of the lyrics and all that component. And then at some point, I just say, that's enough.
So, and so for music, one of the things we know is that the complexity of the song, defined very broadly, is one of the inputs to that distinction. So a simple song, very short increase period and very fast decline. A really complex, rich song, I always think to Bohemian Rhapsody, right? There's so much depth to that song.
A lot of complexity.
It takes so long before you really understand all of it and hear all of it that decline doesn't come until a lot later.
Well, and it's interesting.
Wow.
So if you saw the movie, right, and I don't know if this is based in fact or not, but they talked about the initial panning of that song by all of the critics.
Right.
It was lambasted. It was nobody liked it. No, it
Too
was
long,
horrible.
too complex,
It was
too
like,
weird,
stuff, all these things.
Yeah.
And so to that point, it makes an interesting. What's the uptake on that complexity of a song and how much do you have to overcome in order for it to actually get to a point where people actually will like it? So
the standard theory that explains it is learning, right? So learning is pleasurable from a neurological perspective, and so as you learn something it takes longer to learn something and understand something that's complex than that's something that's really simple. And so the more complex, the longer you have that time period to learn. Every time you hear the song, you hear something new. Every time you look at a amazing work of art, it takes some time before you see all the nuance in it. But once you get that point, everything is downhill from there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm just totally caught up in that. I think that is so cool.
Tim is the songwriter is now thinking through all of his old songs going, am I too complex or too simple? There you go.
This has been a question in the music industry for a long time about why, so everything for many years got boiled down to 305. If a record company couldn't produce a song in 3 minutes and 5 seconds, it wasn't going to be aired. That was the maximum. Billy Joel even referenced it in a song that he wrote about, and they cut it down to 305. So because that was the industry said 3 minutes and 5 seconds is the absolute maximum, and then songs come along in the 70s in pop music, that are longer than that, and you get to in the early 70s, songs like Sweet Judy Blue Eyes or Down by the River are songs that are lengthy, 7 minutes, 13 minutes long. Inagata Davida was 1972, 13 minutes long with a 5-minute drum solo, and it got played. People loved listening to that. So I could wax on, but I'm listening to completely glazed faces there that our listeners are unable to really just enjoy for right now. But
I'm still back at what was the 305. I mean, it seems like it's such an odd number. Not 3 minutes, not 3 minutes and 30 seconds, 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Some
I don't know.
Arbitrary executive said this is it.
We'll have to. That's going to take some more research, unfortunately.
So anyway, Jeff, you were talking about this hedonic decline, all of these various things, and we were talking about listener
Yes.
kind of component. So
what
this
can you
is
do?
leading somewhere. I know.
There's the stuff that's hard and the stuff that's relatively easy. So the harder stuff is if you want to keep enjoying the experiences that you love right now,
Yep.
add variety to them. Right. I put that as hard because that requires a change in behavior. Right. If you love eating M&Ms, I'm going to suggest you have some Skittles every once in a while. But that means doing something different. Yeah, crazy. I know. It's
Sorry, it's like blasphemy, man.
I think we just lost half our listeners right there. Like, oh, what? This was good up until that point of Skittles.
So again, that's difficult, right? I think anytime you recommend to someone that they have to change the way they do things, that's going the uptake on that is going to be pretty minimal, and I understand that. The easier one, and this is why I was talking about this idea that hedonic decline is kind of constructed in the moment, is you can think about things differently. So every time you're about to have your same sandwich for lunch every day, instead of just lamenting about the sandwich, think about the meals that you've had since you've had that last sandwich. Think about the nice dinner you had the night before, the snacks that you had, the breakfast that you ate.
So we can do the framing on ourselves,
We
basically.
can, yeah.
Wow.
And so you can basically, I don't want to say trick yourself because that feels a little weird, but that's roughly what you're trying to do. You're trying to position the experience in the context of all of your experiences as opposed to the thing you happen to be focusing on at that very moment, which is the sandwich you're about to eat.
So looking at those moments in between my last bologna sandwich.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there are ways that that's exactly it, right? But there are ways to play with time as well. So we know that the more markers that you have between memory episodes, the longer in time that feels. So for instance, if we think about when was your last birthday, right? You might say, okay, well, it was whatever many months ago. And you say, okay, well, enumerate all the things you've done since your last birthday.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, you start thinking about that, and all of a sudden your birthday feels like it happened a long time ago. So it's actually fairly easy to move around this perception of when something occurred. And if you can do that in the shorter scale for, let's say, food consumption or music listening or whatever, you should be able to move around your actual experience that you're about to have.
That's fascinating.
I love that. That's a great tip.
Well, and I love the fact that it's actually your enjoyment of that, whatever it would be, is actually impacted.
Yes, very much so.
It is a physical. It goes back to some of the stuff we've talked about in thinking through, like the research on wine consumption and the component of where they frame it as being an expensive wine or a cheap wine, and the way that you actually, regardless, it's the same wine, but you enjoy that expensive wine much more. And it's how you think about it.
In the decision-making world, the idea of constructed preferences has been around for a while, and we're thinking of it in exactly the same way. We're saying this is constructed hedonic experience, right? As a function of whatever's happening in the past.
Yeah, that is terrific. So what did you use music, right?
We do,
You
yeah.
actually use music in this.
So across the many experiments that we've ran, we use lots of different stimuli. Food is our favorite one because it's so visceral for people, right? They eat it, they feel hungry or not hungry, or they eat or they don't eat. They enjoy their food, they don't enjoy it. It's great. But food is really hard because food requires people coming to a laboratory. We have to have sterile conditions, or at least sanitary conditions. We have to have everything correct. It's hard to do. And so what we try to do is find stimuli that are enjoyable to people, but that we could administer maybe either online, or we can just simplify the whole process. So those tend to be things like art. So we have people look at either photos or famous artworks, and they do that repeatedly, or there's a photo slideshow or something like that. We have people watch movies or TV shows, and so that's in the same spirit. But a lot of what we do is have people listen to songs. So we'll have people, we'll give people a choice of something like 30 songs, and we'll usually break it up like top 10 hits for people who like that, maybe some classic rock, and some classical music. So we kind of try to hit most people's preferences.
Okay.
And so they get to choose what they like. And so by definition, that's going to be a song that's really enjoyable at first because they've just told us that that's what they want. And then we're going to put them through a painful exercise of listening to that song repeatedly a number of times. And that's our simulation of what life is really like, which is you listening over and over again. Now, I admit, in the real world, you're not listening to your favorite song 10 times in a row. Well, then maybe you are. Well, maybe. Right?
Maybe we
you
are.
might have Hamilton on repeat going.
Maybe.
Not by choice, but maybe. Yes.
Hashtag just saying.
But what the lab setting lets us do is say, okay, we can find this context. We observe that people enjoy an experience, then over time they enjoyed less, and then we can kind of mess with that, right? We can say, well, what can we do to slow down that rate of decline? What can we do to accelerate it if we're trying to understand the deep psychology of it? And once we have this simulation of the real world, it's like a sandbox that we can play in. So
and the framing becomes
that's one of
that manipulation.
That's one of the manipulations, yes.
Yeah.
So going back to the real world and thinking about classic rock stations.
Sure.
So if this hedonic decline is occurring, classic rock stations are playing the same song from that Tim listens to over and over and over again.
No.
The same Crosby, Stills, and Nash song from 1974.
Sure. So you can unpack anything into kind of two components. One is the inherent quality of it. So certainly some songs are better than others. That's subjective, but at the end of the day, there are some songs.
Yes.
Some songs make it to the top 100, and some don't. Right.
Which is why we don't hear Inagata Divida on the radio anymore. Is that right?
I think that's proof positive right there.
Yes.
Okay. Thank God for that. Yeah.
So you've got that. So you have to start with the base of some things are just going to be better than others. So of course, as a radio station that wants to attract listeners, you're going to play the stuff that's better, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got for every individual how much they're tuning into the radio and how much they're listening to it. And for somebody who's got it on all the time, constantly, I think you might lose that listener after a while, but that's probably not most people's experiences, right? Most people are tuning in occasionally, they catch a song, there's some repetition, but it's really not going to be to the degree that's going to cause problems for the radio station. But by the way, I think it gets really interesting, and I tried for the longest time to partner with a company like Pandora to say, hey, can we play with your algorithm and see if we can figure out how to optimize it in some ways? I'm sure they're doing that, by the way, right? They have scientists that do this as well. I want to do it too. But there, I think it's interesting. Like when I listen to Pandora for my workout mix or whatever, I forget even what it's seeded with. I do get a lot of repetition. And so I'm wondering, are they really optimizing? Are they really thinking through this idea that, yes, I said I liked that song, but let's be clear, I don't want to hear it 20 times, right? I like it occasionally. And where they play with that is really interesting to me, right? I want to say they want to play songs that they know I will like because that'll keep me as a customer, but they don't want to overdo it. And there's the right amount to do, and I don't think they're there yet.
Well, and I'd be interested because I've had the same thought in my head where not only is it the same song, but it's the same genre of music. Yeah. And so I would be very happy if in my Pandora mix that all of a sudden they throw in something that is not in that same genre. Yeah. Similar, but different enough that it's noticeable. I am now going, that's unique and cool.
Yeah, and so we know, for instance, when we talk about variety, similarity is a continuum, right? So things can, the same thing is identical. That's super similar, right? Two wildly different things are very different, not similar, but there's everything in between. So same artist, same album, same genre, right? However you play with it, there's varying similarity, and they should be taking advantage of that.
They should be.
I think that's cool.
So I'm going to go back on to the classic rock thing, and I'm sorry, Tim.
Is this a harping thing?
No, this is not a harping thing. This is actually a question, and I don't know. I don't think your research went into this, but I'm wondering, so with the classic rock component and people of a certain age, that we first heard those songs back in a very formative time of our life. And so to a certain degree, when we hear those songs, we tend to potentially go back in time to that moment or that era of our life. And does that so is there anything about this hedonic decline where, I might not have listened to my, Van Halen song for the upteenth time in 1987, and I'm just sick of it. But now that I hear it because it's been so long, how does that work? I mean, have you done anything to look at that?
Not exactly, but funny enough, I do study this area of sentimental value, which is, I think, fascinating. And so I'm going to distinguish sentimental value from nostalgia, which is what I think you're talking about.
Okay.
So the difference is nostalgia is a longing for the past.
Okay.
So you might say, hey, weren't things great back in high school when I was, rocking my leather jacket or whatever?
When I had hair, and it was awesome.
But sentimental value is separate. It's basically the value you're getting right in the moment from an object that has some connection to some other person or event, right? Cool. So the song might just give you value because it makes you think of how fun high school was. It doesn't make you want to go back in time and relive it. It's just kind of inherently extra value, extra special. And so the short answer is yes, right? You might be continuing to listen to that because on top of all the things we've talked about, there's some component of sentimental value that you're getting in the moment. And maybe there's also some nostalgia in there as well, where you might say, hey, wouldn't it be great?
Very cool.
Yeah. Sentimental value is good. Yeah.
Yeah. Sentimental value is great. Yeah.
Kurt, is there anything else that you'd like to?
No, I think this has been really fascinating. I'm going to have fun in this grooving session. So.
Yeah, it is going to be fun. But Jeff, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate you being a part of this little time here at Carnegie Mellon.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our hedonically declining brains.
Declining!
Actually, it could just be declining, maybe not hedonically declining. It could just very well be declining.
And everything that falls under decline would fit. I think everything would fit. So Kurt, what struck you?
Hedonic decline.
Yeah.
I thought the concept was really interesting. There's that component of, looking at a song. I thought what was really interesting is the complexity or lack of the simplicity or the complexity of the song helped in the rate of that decline. So the simpler the song, the more you liked it at the beginning, easier it was to kind of get, oh, this is catchy, groovy, I like it, but the quicker that it declined. And I thought that might have some kind of components that would also play into businesses. So,
yeah, it certainly would. I agreed. First, I gotta say, I think it's pretty awesome that we have a guest just volunteer music as the metaphor for the basis of the work. That was pretty great.
You would like that.
I was pretty happy with that. So Jeff gets double bonus points for me from that. But yeah, so if we think about adaption or adoption of a product, what about an iPhone? How about a product that is so easy to use? If we just think of it as a phone, super easy. Yet a level of complexity that if we wanted to go beyond phone, we've got messages and we've got email and we've got GPS and we've got literally thousands of apps to keep our brain engaged and continuously learning more about this one device.
But the element of that you're saying is it combines both that simplicity with the complexity.
That's right. So it combines simplicity to get us in, to make it easy. And it's like, oh, that's that little earworm song, right, that we like. But it's also Bohemian Rhapsody on the back end because it's going to continue to challenge us and give us something rewarding for a long time.
Which is one of the reasons that the smartphones, right, have become so ubiquitous that they have just taken over the world as part of that. So from an organizational perspective, what can you do to your product to both make it simple and yet have that layer of complexity on it?
Right. That's the question, is if you're developing a new product or a new service, how can it be super easy to grasp up front that has that earworm kind of capability of, oh, this is going to be super easy. Oh, I like the sound of this, like from the first time I heard it. And, but if it only stays in that simple mode, then the decline happens quickly.
Right.
So it's got to have complexity on the back end to keep the listener, so to speak, the customer or the employee engaged for a longer period of time.
So going on your employee component, how do we use this inside of an organization with teams or with the systems and processes that you have in place, the incentives that are being done? Is there any way, again, to take that component of saying, hey, do we get to a point of hedonic decline where this task is no longer fun, right?
Yeah, well, but before you got to that end, I was thinking you use the 4-drive model a lot in your consulting work. And so that around challenge, this is an important part of it, right? We need to be challenged.
Yeah, the drive to challenge, and I always often use the example of it's like a video game, right? If I'm playing Pac-Man and I get in and it's fun and I'm playing it, if it's a challenge, but then once I master that level 1, if level 2 is exactly the same and I can get through it easy and level 3 is the same, I'm not going to play that very much longer. I need to increase, the challenge needs to increase. And so that gets into, again, that element of, hey, it's relatively easy to understand and get in. Again, using the Pac-Man analogy, you go in, you got to get these dots and evade the ghosts and kind of do that. But then if that complexity doesn't increase, you're not learning, you're not having any more challenges to it. So I think that can play into this. So thinking about jobs, right? Is my job one where it becomes so routine that I've kind of become, the enjoyment, the challenge. I'm no longer learning inside of that work.
Yeah. So are we necessarily talking about white collar jobs versus blue collar jobs?
No, I think you can have it in both, right? I mean, I think there are jobs that are both blue collar that can be challenging, that you can have new challenges presented on that every time. I think of, my plumber, who we call on way too often, but each time is a brand new challenge, and sometimes it's being, idiot user, but sometimes it's, other challenges that they have to figure out, and it's kind of that component. In the same instance, I think you can have white collar jobs where that work is really redundant. You're entering data in, you're doing whatever,
the same report every specific amount of time,
every month, every week, whatever it would be. You're dealing with customers in the same exact way, even salespeople, where it is a script that you're reading. So I think there's ways to think about the way that you design a job, and can you build it so that you're keeping some of that complexity in, but yes, still making it easy enough to understand. One of the things that we talked about in a past episode was this component of using extrinsic incentive to jumpstart some intrinsic motivation. So this is where you go into...
I'm glad you brought that up.
Into some of this component of saying, hey, I have a job or a task or something that you're doing that might be complex and may not get somebody really motivated to do it. It might be difficult, right? I have to learn. I have to do something above and beyond. And so I may not just naturally be inclined to do it. Yeah. However, if I give you an incentive to start, now I have that inclination to start and to start doing it. And can that then lend itself into, wow, this is actually challenging. I'm liking this. This is something that is interesting. And so
But it took getting a little sugar on the cereal before you tried it.
Right.
Yeah. And this is part of my beef with the way the Dan Pink message from his book Drive has become evangelized. It's all around, no, any kind of extrinsic motivation is bad. We've always got to rely on intrinsic. And I think that that's just bullshit. I think that we really need to think that there are situations where it's really good to have just to think about putting a little sugar on the cereal to get somebody in to especially a more difficult task, to get them engaged. And then they find, oh, there's something rewarding about this. There is something intrinsically interesting about this. I'm finding rewards in just doing the work.
No, we can go off on a whole separate topic on Dan Pink, and this the fact of how the incentive is designed can impact the overall motivation and other things. He used a lot of DC and Ryan and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, what else did you find interesting?
Well, I think the whole discussion of heels is so interesting. I got to go there because I love. This has been on my mind for a long time, this whole idea of how we like to perceive ourselves. And this relates back to incentives and rewards.
Okay.
People who earn non-monetary awards, unlike people who earn more cash rewards, are more likely to indulge. And so they're going to have more stuff in their house. They might have a bigger vacation than they would afford for themselves. They got a bigger TV or a home theater system that's more generous and more luxurious than what they would spend their own money on. And that gets them into a higher sort of a slightly, they get a little closer to country club and a little further away from Sam's Club.
So taking the conversation that we had about the heels, right? And bringing it back to that, what you're saying is the fact that, hey, I moved to a zip code that has a lesser socioeconomic component. I keep my higher level heels
because that differentiates me.
And puts me closer to the country club versus the other way around.
Yeah, and if I move from the Sam's Club to the country club, I want to quickly adopt the new country club modes, right? I want to be seen as on par rather than being subpar.
So, my own personal, I'm going back way back, right? When I was a teenager, I moved from Wayzata, Minnesota, one of the most
an elite
upscale kind of zip codes in the country, to Bettendorf, Iowa, which is a nice place, but it does not have that same component.
And how did you feel when you were making that move? Did you feel like you were going from country club to Sam's Club?
More, yeah. I mean, there was a component of it,
Yeah.
and obviously some of it was true, some of it wasn't. You know, there's different components around that. But I was trying to think back when we started talking about this. Did I change the way that I dressed? Did I modify how I looked to fit in with the current styles that were in Bettendorf? Or did I maintain the styles that we had at Wayzata Junior High versus, Blackhawk Junior High down in Iowa? And I it's many, many, many years ago. But I think I kind of stayed with it up until a certain point. And then at a certain point, I just more identified with, I didn't, it was further away. So I didn't not.
Right. And eventually because you were living every single day in Bettendorf, Iowa, a small town, right? And that became your life.
Yeah.
So those became the social norms that you finally adapted to.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I think that the heel component is, it's a window into a larger component of how we view ourselves and then how we maintain or adopt some of those older components when we move into different kind of socioeconomic statuses. Wonder if there's components of the same thing, even maybe not zip code moving, but what happens if you do economically really well for a while and then fall into economic hard times? Do you maintain those the trappings of that higher wealth status, or do you go, oh no, I need to cut what we spend, and I'm not going to drive that car. I'm not going to dress in
In those expensive clothes. Yeah. This also relates to an old meme around dress in the job that you want to be. So if you're a junior associate and you want to eventually become a more senior associate in that organization, then you should wear the clothes of the senior, sort of make yourself look like you're already part of that club, part of that tribe.
Interesting.
And this was even further back when dinosaurs ruled the earth and I was in college. That was a pretty common model. And I see it comes up every now and then in searches. I still see people writing about dress in the role that you want to take on.
And I think that's really interesting. Again, does it signal tribe? Does dress signal that you are part of this tribe, various different things? I think there's some merit to that if it is something that isn't necessarily about you, right? I think there's also this component of, but dressing in somebody else's clothes takes away from who I am, and so therefore, why should I have to do that?
Yeah.
Which I could see there could be some ethical considerations of that. But I think, these are things that happen, I think, at a subconscious level. They're not consciously thinking, the people in the current tribe that I'm trying to dress up to or not dress up to.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So,
right. Okay, what else?
The whole conversation on policy lies versus personal lies.
Yeah.
And, looking at that from the whole political spectrum is really interesting, and you can kind of look at the current political environment right now, and you wonder, it doesn't seem like it necessarily is as applicable in maybe with certain individuals, I don't know, that are currently out there that do seem to do both policy and personal lies, and yet they still have maintain a base. Not going to go there because I think that's a whole another.
That's another whole thing, right?
But I do wonder, in our personal lives, do we take those lies that we tend to all? I would argue that all of us lie. Right? Dan Ariely says that we all lie.
Everybody's in.
It's to the extent that we lie. And I'm wondering if it's not only the extent, but it's what we lie about.
Yeah.
And so do we have more components if I was I'm working with a potential new client, and not that I would do this, but they're asking, how many of these programs have you done? And I go, oh, I've done 6 of them. When in reality, I've done maybe 2 and 4 that are kind of like it, but I could probably and they find out.
You're stretching a bit.
I'm stretching a bit.
Yeah.
Versus something about me personally. Which one has the greater magnitude on how well they trust or like me?
Yeah.
So, or say that's okay, right? Because that was part of this component. It was
where do we give permission? Where do we allow that to happen?
Right. And what do you think?
I think that in my own life, I can think of sort of the stretches, and when I've been aware of people that I know are in a business situation and they're kind of stretching at the truth, and I'm much more forgiving of that.
The resume, right? Pretty much every resume.
I was responsible for blah-bitty, blah-bitty, blah.
And you're going, yeah, really? you worked on the team and you were, a junior associate. So...
But to hear someone say, "Oh, yeah, I knew that person in high school," when I know that they didn't, it's like, why would you say that?
Exactly.
Why would you go there?
Yeah.
And so I'm as being one of
I was in a rock band when I was a kid. That doesn't really.
But you were.
I was not. There was no way I was. So
yeah.
I did have rock band hair at one point.
I want to see pictures.
I don't have any. I'm sorry. Maybe that was a real lie. I don't know. There we go. But I think there's something to that, right? There's something to the component of, what you're lying about. And is it personal in nature, or is it more general in nature? And I think you're much more forgiving of those more general ones. So,
yeah. Okay. So we had this conversation with Jeff about the complexity and the simplicity of music. Give me an example of a complex song that you took a long time to really, really enjoy, but eventually you fell in love with it.
Oh my God, you're asking me specifics. I don't do specifics. I do generals.
Okay.
I do the broad answer. So I don't. I know there are when he talked about that, it resonated.
It did resonate with you.
It resonated with me very much.
Did Bohemian Rhapsody resonate with you? I mean, didn't he talk about Bohemian Rhapsody?
Yeah, he talked about Bohemian Rhapsody. And
was that a song that you were instantly engaged in, or did it sort of take a while?
I think it was one of those songs that I just grew up with and heard on the radio
over and
in
over
the day
again. Yeah.
Because that's what you did.
Yeah.
And then throughout the, Mike Myers and Wayne's World, brought it back to that was its second, because it hit number 1
again
after that, right?
Yeah, it did.
Which 20 years after the original or whatever it was. So I think I don't know. That's my question.
Okay.
That being said, I do know there's some simple songs that I have just absolutely loved, and then very quickly got sick of because I listened to them, over and over, and then it's just like, I'm done with this. And I don't, there's other songs that I think have more complexity, and for me, it's often lyrical complexity in trying to understand the words and the meaning of those words than maybe the musical component. So, yeah.
Okay.
What about you?
I remember very distinctly hearing Asia by Steely Dan, that album. And
I thought you meant the band Asia. I was going, oh my gosh, Tim.
No, I remember.
That's an 80s band.
I know, and they were a great band, actually.
But you never talk about 80s bands. You just talk about 70s and 60s bands.
Let's talk about Toto. We could talk about Toto for hours because I love those guys. They're an 80s band, right?
They were a 70s band.
They were not?
I think they started in the 70s.
Well, okay, so, but when was Africa and 99 and all those tunes? Those were in the 80s.
They're a 70s band that just made music in the 80s. But okay, let's go with that. Anyway, you're Asia from Steely Dan.
Yeah. So I remember hearing it the first time and just going, what's appealing about that? There's a little bit of a hook here. There's a little bit of a hook there. And then the more that I heard it was like, oh, wow, I like, and how do they do those vocals? And oh my gosh, the horn section that comes in just right there, or the guitar lead that that doesn't start on the downbeat, and it got the complexity continued to just draw me in and draw me in and draw me in.
Very cool.
So yeah, love that tune.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
That wraps up our another discussion. Please, if you haven't already, and I'm sure everyone right now is turning to create a review on their favorite podcasting service.
Scroll down on your phone.
Be a part of the many who are already doing it at this moment.
And with that,
Keep on grooving.